Elizabeth Kendrick ducked through the doorway of Dodge City's mercantile, stooping low as she always did, though she still managed to knock her bonnet askew. At 6 feet and 2 inches tall, she'd long grown accustomed to a world that wasn't built for her, but that didn't make the daily reminders any less humiliating. Kansas Territory, 1872, a place and time that valued women who were delicate, dainty things. Elizabeth was none of these, and the citizens of Dodge City never let her forget it. "Well, if it isn't the walking watchtower," drawled Mabel Thompson from behind the counter. "Come to block out the sun again, have you?" Elizabeth pressed her lips together, ignoring the titters from the women browsing fabric nearby. She'd been in Dodge City only 3 months, having arrived after her father's death left her with nothing but a trunk of clothes and her father's pocket watch. Her Aunt Harriet had reluctantly offered her a place to stay, but Elizabeth knew she was an unwelcome burden, particularly since her presence seemed to drive away eligible bachelors who might have called on her petite, perfectly proportioned cousin Fanny. "Just some thread and buttons, please," Elizabeth said quietly, placing her basket on the counter. "And perhaps some of that blue calico if you have any left." "Goodness, girl," Mrs. Thompson sniffed. "What's the use in pretending? No amount of pretty fabric's going to make you look like a proper lady. You'd be better off buying trousers." Fresh laughter erupted, and Elizabeth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I believe the lady asked for calico," came a deep voice from the doorway. Elizabeth turned to see a man she didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore the dust of the trail on his clothes, but there was nothing trail-worn about the way he held himself, straight-backed and commanding. "Xavier Odell," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat. "Just rode into town." His eyes met Elizabeth's directly level with her own. She realized with a start he had to be at least 6'4". "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Mr. Odell, Mrs. Thompson said, her smile tight. "And I don't recall asking for yours regarding this lady's purchases," he replied pleasantly, but there was steel beneath his words. Mrs. Thompson's mouth snapped shut. She turned to Elizabeth with considerably less venom. "The blue calico's 3 cents a yard." As Elizabeth completed her transaction, she was acutely aware of Xavier Odell's presence by the door. When she gathered her parcels to leave, he touched the brim of his hat again. "Miss Kendrick." "Elizabeth Kendrick," she supplied, startled by her own willingness to engage. "Miss Kendrick." "Might I walk with you? I'm new to town and could use some direction." The women in the shop watched with undisguised curiosity as Elizabeth nodded and they stepped outside together. "You didn't have to do that," she said once they were on the boardwalk. "Do what?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Stand up for me. I'm accustomed to their comments." "That doesn't make them right." He studied her face. "Where might a man find a decent meal in this town? Bessie's Cafe serves good food. It's just down the street." Elizabeth gestured vaguely, suddenly self-conscious about her height next to his. For once, she didn't feel like a giantess. It was unsettling. "Would you join me?" "As a thank you for the directions," he added with a smile that transformed his weathered face. Elizabeth hesitated. No man had ever asked to dine with her, not in Dodge City or back in St. Louis. "I should return to my aunt's home," she replied carefully. "She'll be expecting me." "Another time, then," he said easily, as though the invitation was a certainty rather than a polite fiction. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried away, feeling his eyes on her back. Only when she reached Aunt Harriet's front gate did she realize she was smiling. Xavier Odell watched Elizabeth Kendrick walk away, noting the graceful way she carried herself despite her obvious discomfort. He'd seen it the moment he entered the mercantile, the tall, striking woman hunching her shoulders slightly. as if trying to diminish herself. He'd spent his life standing out in a crowd, but as a man, his height had been an asset. For Elizabeth Kendrick, it clearly was a burden. Something about her dignified bearing in the face of those harpies' mockery had stirred something in him. Dodge City was supposed to be just another stop on his journey, a place to rest, before heading to his newly acquired ranch, 20 miles outside of town. But as he made his way to Bessie's Cafe, Xavier found himself thinking that perhaps Dodge City might hold more interest than he'd initially thought. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Elizabeth woke early, as was her custom. Her aunt's house was modest but comfortable, with 3 bedrooms, one for Aunt Harriet, one for Fanny, and a converted sewing room where Elizabeth slept on a too-short bed, her feet hanging off the end. She dressed quickly in one of her serviceable calico dresses, pinned her honey-brown hair into a simple knot, and headed downstairs to start breakfast. Cooking was one of the few skills for which Aunt Harriet praised her, and Elizabeth had learned to take pride in small victories. "There you are," Aunt Harriet said when she entered the kitchen an hour later. "Fanny says she saw you talking to a stranger yesterday, a tall man." Elizabeth concentrated on flipping the hot cakes. "He's new in town, Xavier Odell." Xavier Odell. Fanny appeared in the doorway, her golden curls still in papers. "Is he the one who bought the old Davidson place? I heard Mrs. Peterson telling Mother about him yesterday. Apparently, he's from Texas originally, made his fortune in cattle, and now he's settling here." Her eyes gleamed. "They say he's quite wealthy." "I wouldn't know," Elizabeth replied, setting plates on the table. "We barely spoke." "Well, he certainly noticed you," Fanny said with a sly smile, "though I suppose it's hard not to." The barb was subtle but effective. Elizabeth busied herself with the coffee pot, hoping her aunt wouldn't pick up the thread. "Elizabeth," Aunt Harriet sighed, "you must stop slouching. It only draws more attention to your unfortunate stature." "Yes, Aunt," Elizabeth murmured, though she hadn't been slouching at all. After breakfast, Elizabeth walked to the schoolhouse where she'd secured a position as a teacher's assistant. It wasn't much, but it provided her with a small income, lessening her dependence on her aunt's charity. The children, at least, didn't seem to mind her height. In fact, they often asked her to reach things from high shelves or to lift them to see out the high windows. It was one of the few places where Elizabeth felt her height was an advantage rather than a liability. She was helping a group of younger children with their letters when the schoolroom door opened. Miss Winters, the head teacher, looked up with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Odell, do come in. Children, this is Mr. Odell. He's new to our community and has generously offered to donate some books to our school library." Elizabeth's head snapped up to see Xavier Odell standing in the doorway, a crate of books in his arms. He smiled when he saw her, genuine pleasure lighting his eyes. "Miss Kendrick." "I didn't realize you were a teacher." "Miss Kendrick is my invaluable assistant," Miss Winters said warmly. "I don't know what we'd do without her." Elizabeth felt a flush of gratitude toward the older woman, who had never once commented on her height and always treated her with respect. "I can believe that," Xavier replied, setting the crate down on Miss Winters' desk. "I've brought some books that I thought the children might enjoy. A few novels, some history texts, and a collection of poetry." "How thoughtful," Miss Winters exclaimed, examining the books. "The children will be thrilled. Won't you stay for a while? Perhaps you could tell the older students about your travels. I understand you've come quite a distance." Xavier agreed readily, and for the next hour he captivated the children with tales of cattle drives, life in Texas, and the different territories he'd visited. Elizabeth watched him, noting how he interacted with the children, patient, kind, and genuinely interested in their questions. When school was dismissed for the day, Elizabeth found herself lingering, organizing books that didn't need organizing, while Xavier and Miss Winters chatted. "Miss Kendrick," Xavier said, as Miss Winters excused herself to walk some of the younger children home. "I was hoping I might see you again." Elizabeth straightened a stack of primers. "It's a small town, Mr. Odell. It's hard not to see people." "I'd like to see you specifically," he clarified, his directness taking her aback. "Perhaps for that meal we discussed." Elizabeth looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or hidden agenda. She found none, only a straightforward interest that both thrilled and terrified her. "I don't think that would be wise," she said finally, "because I'm new in town." "Or because you're afraid of what people might say?" "Both," she admitted. "Dodge City thrives on gossip, Mr. Odell, and I'm already the subject of enough talk without adding to it." "Because you're tall," he stated plainly. "Because I'm different," she corrected. "And you're conspicuous as well." He laughed at that, a rich, warm sound. "I've been called many things, Miss Kendrick, but conspicuous is a new one. I like it." His expression sobered. "But I understand your concern. How about a compromise? The town's having a social on Saturday night at the church. Would you consider attending? We could speak there in full view of everyone, with nothing for the gossips to embellish." Elizabeth hesitated. She'd planned to avoid the social, as she always did. Such gatherings only emphasized her outsider status. She was too tall to dance comfortably with most men, and she invariably ended up sitting with the chaperones, watching others enjoy themselves. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "I hope you do," Xavier replied, picking up his hat. "Until Saturday, then, Miss Kendrick." As he left, Elizabeth wondered what she'd gotten herself into, and why, despite her misgivings, she was already planning what dress to wear to the social. The following days passed in a blur of routine teaching, helping around her aunt's house, and avoiding the curious stares that followed her through town. Word had spread about Xavier Odell's interest in her, creating a fresh wave of gossip. "I heard he's only talking to her because they're both freaks of nature," Elizabeth overheard Mrs. Peterson telling Mrs. Thompson outside the general store. "Birds of a feather, I suppose." "Well, at least she won't have to stoop to kiss him," Mrs. Thompson replied with a nasty laugh. "Though I can't imagine any man wanting to court the likes of her. There's nothing feminine about a woman that size." Elizabeth had hurried past, pretending not to hear, but the words stung nonetheless. She'd spent her entire life being told she was too tall, too big, too much. Sometimes she wondered if they were right, if there was something fundamentally unwomanly about her. By Saturday, Elizabeth had nearly convinced herself not to attend the social. What was the point? It would only lead to more mockery, more hurt. But then she remembered the way Xavier had stood up for her in the mercantile, the genuine interest in his eyes, and she found herself putting on her best dress, a deep blue affair that she'd sewn herself, with careful attention to creating the illusion of a more normal female silhouette. "You're actually going?" Fanny asked, watching Elizabeth pin her hair. "I thought you hated these gatherings." "I do," Elizabeth admitted, "but perhaps it's time I stopped hiding." Fanny studied her for a moment. "It's because of him, isn't it? The tall Texan." Elizabeth didn't answer, but her blush gave her away. "Be careful, Lizzie," Fanny said, using the childhood nickname she rarely employed anymore. "Men can be cruel, especially when a woman doesn't fit their idea of what's proper." Elizabeth was surprised by her cousin's concern. "I'm just going to a church social, Fanny. Nothing more." But as they walked to the church together, Elizabeth's stomach churned with nerves. Would Xavier be there? And if he was, would he still want to speak with her when surrounded by the pretty, petite women of Dodge City? The church was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers, with tables of food set up along one wall and space cleared for dancing. Elizabeth immediately felt out of place among the festive crowd, hyper-aware of how she towered over most of the women and even some of the men. Then she saw him standing by the punch bowl, scanning the room. When his eyes found her, his face lit up with a smile that made something flutter in her chest. He made his way toward her with purposeful strides. "Miss Kendrick," he said, bowing slightly, "you look beautiful this evening." The compliment was so unexpected that Elizabeth could only stare at him. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come," he continued, seemingly unperturbed by her silence. "I nearly didn't," she admitted. "I'm glad you changed your mind." He offered his arm. "Would you care for some punch?" Elizabeth was acutely aware of the stares as she placed her hand on Xavier's arm and allowed him to lead her to the refreshment table. Whispers followed them, but Xavier seemed completely untroubled by the attention. "Are you enjoying Dodge City so far, Mr. Odell?" she asked, desperate to fill the silence between them. "It has its charms," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "Though I've found the welcome somewhat mixed. Small towns can be wary of newcomers." "Is that why they mock you, because you're a newcomer?" Elizabeth nearly choked on her punch. "No, that is. I apologize for my directness," Xavier said, his voice gentle. "But I've seen how some people in town treat you, and I've heard the comments." Elizabeth set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "They mock me because I'm tall. Because I don't fit their idea of what a woman should be. I've been too tall my entire life, Mr. Odell. I'm used to it." "Being used to something doesn't make it right," he said, echoing his words from their first meeting. "And for what it's worth, I think you're exactly what a woman should be." Before Elizabeth could respond, the band struck up a lively reel. Xavier set his cup aside and held out his hand. "Would you do me the honor of dancing with me, Miss Kendrick?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't dance. I'm too tall," he supplied with a smile. "I believe I can accommodate you." And he could. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth danced with a partner who didn't have to reach up awkwardly or strain to lead her. They moved together with surprising grace, and Elizabeth found herself laughing as Xavier guided her through the steps. From the corner of her eye, she could see people watching, some with disapproval, others with curiosity. But for once, she didn't care. The joy of dancing without self-consciousness was too great. As the evening progressed, they danced more, talked, and shared pieces of themselves. Xavier told her about growing up in Texas, the son of a rancher who taught him the value of hard work and treating people fairly. Elizabeth shared stories of her father, a kind but impractical man who'd filled her childhood with books and ideas but little financial security. "He sounds like a good man," Xavier said as they strolled outside for a breath of fresh air. "He was," Elizabeth agreed. "He never made me feel like there was anything wrong with me. He used to say I was meant to stand tall because I had a greater perspective than others." "Wise words," Xavier murmured. "My father used to say something similar, that my height was God's way of ensuring I could always see over the heads of the crowd, to make sure I was heading in the right direction." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, their path lit by the moon. "Why did you really come to Dodge City, Mr. Odell?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. "It seems an unlikely place for a successful rancher to settle." Xavier was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. Then he sighed. "I wanted a fresh start," he said finally. "I was engaged back in Texas. Caroline was. Everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, well-bred, from a good family. But she couldn't bear the thought of being married to the tallest man in the county, as she put it. Said she'd be laughed at standing next to me. That no one would see her, only my height." He shook his head. "She broke our engagement 3 days before the wedding." Elizabeth felt a surge of empathy. "I'm sorry. Don't be. It was the best thing that could have happened." Made me realize I needed someone who sees my height as part of me, not as something to be ashamed of. He turned to face her, his eyes serious in the moonlight. Someone like you, Elizabeth. The use of her given name sent a thrill through her. You barely know me, she whispered. I know enough, he replied. I know you face mockery with dignity. I know you're kind to your students and that you make the best apple pie in Kansas, according to Tommy Wilson in your class. I know you love books and can recite Wordsworth from memory. He smiled. And I know I'd like the chance to learn more. Elizabeth's heart raced. People will talk. People always talk, he said with a shrug. Let them. I'd rather be happy and gossiped about than miserable and forgotten. The church bell chimed, signaling the end of the social. Elizabeth realized with a start that they needed to return. My aunt will be looking for me. Xavier nodded, offering his arm once more. May I call on you tomorrow, properly with your aunt's permission? Elizabeth hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, you may. As they walked back toward the church, Elizabeth stood straight and tall beside him, no longer trying to minimize her height. For the first time in her life, she felt as though being tall might not be a curse after all. True to his word, Xavier called on Elizabeth the following afternoon, arriving at Aunt Harriet's doorstep with a bouquet of wildflowers and his hat in hand. Aunt Harriet received him with barely concealed astonishment, while Fanny watched the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. To Elizabeth's surprise, Xavier charmed her aunt completely, complimenting her home, asking interested questions about her church work, and generally behaving like the perfect gentleman. May I have your permission to take Miss Elizabeth for a drive this afternoon, Mrs. Kendrick? He asked politely. Aunt Harriet, who was not actually married but preferred the courtesy title, preened slightly. Well, I suppose that would be acceptable as long as you return before dark. And so Elizabeth found herself seated beside Xavier in his smart buggy, driving through the countryside surrounding Dodge City. Your aunt seems nice, Xavier commented as they left the town behind. Elizabeth laughed. She's not my aunt, actually. She's my father's cousin, but aunt is simpler. And she's been kind enough to take me in, even though I'm a burden to her. A burden? I find that hard to believe. I'm not the sort of niece who attracts advantageous marriage proposals, Elizabeth said dryly. In fact, I suspect my presence drives away potential suitors for Fanny. Who wants to court a girl whose cousin is an Amazon? Xavier frowned. Anyone who judges Fanny by your appearance isn't worth her time, and anyone who can't see your worth is blind. Elizabeth looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity in his voice. Tell me about your ranch, she said, changing the subject. Xavier allowed the diversion, describing the property he'd purchased 1,000 acres with a sturdy house, good water access, and room for the herd of cattle he planned to establish. It needs some work, he admitted. The previous owner let things slide in his later years, but the bones are good. I'm staying in town while some repairs are being made to the house, but I hope to move out there permanently within a month. It sounds lovely, Elizabeth said sincerely. I'd like to show it to you someday, Xavier said, his eyes briefly leaving the road to meet hers. If you're interested. Elizabeth nodded, a warm glow spreading through her at the implied promise of future outings. Over the next few weeks, Xavier became a regular visitor at Aunt Harriet's home. He escorted Elizabeth to church, took her for drives, and once even convinced her to have dinner with him at Bessie's Cafe, despite her fear of public scrutiny. To Elizabeth's surprise, the more openly Xavier courted her, the less people seemed to mock her height. It was as if his obvious admiration cast her in a new light. There were still whispers and stares, of course, but they lacked the cruelty she'd grown accustomed to. It's because you're walking differently, Miss Winters observed one day after school. You're not trying to make yourself smaller anymore." Elizabeth hadn't realized the change in her bearing, but she knew the cause. Xavier made her feel proud of her height, not ashamed of it. One warm Saturday in early June, Xavier invited Elizabeth to see his ranch. The house repairs were complete, and he was preparing to move from the hotel in town to his permanent residence. "It's not proper for me to visit unchaperoned," Elizabeth protested. "Your aunt and cousin are welcome to join us," Xavier replied smoothly. "In fact, I insist upon it." And so the four of them made the journey, with Aunt Harriet maintaining a running commentary on the wildflowers, the weather, and the scandalous behavior of Mrs. Peterson, who had apparently been seen walking alone with the new doctor. The ranch, when they arrived, took Elizabeth's breath away. The house was larger than she'd expected, a handsome two-story structure with a wide porch and tall windows. The surrounding land rolled gently, dotted with trees and bisected by a clear stream. "It's beautiful," she breathed as Xavier helped her down from the buggy. "I hoped you'd think so," he said quietly, for her ears alone. While Aunt Harriet and Fanny explored the garden, Xavier showed Elizabeth through the house. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with high ceilings that made Elizabeth feel, for once, that a space had been designed with someone like her in mind. In the parlor, Xavier stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "What do you think? Could you be happy in a place like this?" Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. "It's a wonderful home, Xavier. You should be very proud." "That's not what I asked," he said gently. "I asked if you could be happy here, with me." Elizabeth stared at him, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you?" Xavier took her hands in his. "I had a whole speech planned. I was going to wait, do this properly. But standing here with you in what could be our home. Elizabeth, I've fallen in love with you. I know it's soon, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. "People will talk," she whispered. "Let them," Xavier said fiercely. "I don't care what anyone says. I love you, your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. And yes, your height. I love that I can look you in the eye without craning my neck. I love that we fit together perfectly. I love everything about you, Elizabeth Kendrick." "Yes," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier." His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a passion that left Elizabeth breathless. When they finally broke apart, she laughed shakily. "What will Aunt Harriet say? Probably that we're rushing things," Xavier admitted, "and she might be right. But I know what I want, Elizabeth. I want a life with you." As predicted, Aunt Harriet thought they should wait, have a longer engagement. But Xavier was persuasive, and in the end, they compromised on a wedding date 6 weeks away, in mid-July. The news of their engagement spread through Dodge City like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some offered genuine congratulations, while others whispered behind their hands, "They'll make such odd-looking children," Elizabeth overheard Mrs. Thompson telling Mrs. Peterson one day. "Imagine giants running around Dodge City." The comment stung, but Elizabeth forced herself to stand tall and walk past with her head held high, the way Xavier always did. Not everyone was unkind. Miss Winters was delighted by the news and offered to help with wedding preparations. The children in Elizabeth's class were thrilled, especially when Xavier started dropping by occasionally to help with reading lessons or to tell them stories of life on the trail. As the wedding approached, Elizabeth found herself busier than she'd ever been, finishing the school term, sewing her wedding dress with Fanny's help, and preparing to move to Xavier's ranch. Through it all, Xavier was a constant support, handling the inevitable gossip with grace and never once making Elizabeth feel anything but cherished. The day before the wedding, disaster struck. Elizabeth was in the schoolhouse, collecting the last of her things, when she heard the commotion outside. Running to the door, she saw a crowd gathering around someone on the ground. Her heart stopped when she recognized Xavier's chestnut gelding standing riderless nearby. Pushing through the crowd, she found Xavier on the ground, his face contorted in pain. Dr. Sullivan was already kneeling beside him. "What happened?" Elizabeth gasped, dropping to her knees beside Xavier. "Horse threw him," someone said, "spooked by a rattlesnake." "I'm fine," Xavier ground out, though his pale face belied his words. "Just my leg." Dr. Sullivan's expression was grim. "It's broken, I'm afraid. Clean break, but he won't be walking down any aisle tomorrow." "Then we'll postpone," Elizabeth said immediately, taking Xavier's hand. "No," Xavier said firmly, despite his pain. "We're getting married tomorrow, broken leg or not. I'll hop down the aisle if I have to," and that's exactly what happened. With his leg splinted and bandaged, supported by crutches and sheer determination, Xavier Odell married Elizabeth Kendrick the next day in the small church in Dodge City. The townspeople turned out in force, some out of genuine goodwill, others from curiosity, but Elizabeth hardly noticed them. All she saw was Xavier, standing tall and proud at the altar, waiting for her. As she walked toward him, she kept her back straight and her head high, no longer concerned about appearing too tall or too noticeable. She was Elizabeth Kendrick, soon to be Elizabeth Odell, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly the right size. After the ceremony, even Mrs. Thompson was moved to offer grudging congratulations. "You make a handsome couple," she admitted, "though I still say you'll have giant children." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Xavier replied with a smile. "We can only hope they'll inherit their mother's grace and beauty." The woman actually blushed before hurrying away. "You didn't have to do that," Elizabeth murmured as they received their guests at the small reception in the church hall. "Do what? Speak the truth." Xavier squeezed her hand. "Get used to it, Mrs. Odell. I intend to spend the rest of my life telling everyone how fortunate I am to have married you." Their first year of marriage was both challenging and wonderful. Xavier's broken leg healed slowly, forcing him to rely on hired hands more than he'd planned for the initial work of establishing his cattle ranch. Elizabeth proved to be an able partner, learning to manage the household accounts, help with the lighter ranch work, and even assist with the cattle when needed. The town's attitude toward them gradually shifted. Those who had mocked Elizabeth's height found it harder to do so when confronted with her obvious happiness and Xavier's unwavering devotion. The fact that their ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the area, also helped change perceptions. In the spring of 1874, almost a year after their wedding, Elizabeth discovered she was expecting their first child. Xavier was ecstatic, spinning her around the kitchen despite her protests that she was too heavy. "Nonsense," he laughed, setting her gently on her feet. "You're perfect. And our child will be perfect, whether tall or short or somewhere in between." The pregnancy progressed well, though Elizabeth often joked that she finally understood what it was like to be unable to see her own feet. Dr. Sullivan monitored her carefully, concerned about potential complications due to her height, but Elizabeth remained healthy and strong. In late November, after a difficult but ultimately successful labor, Elizabeth gave birth to a robust baby boy. They named him Frederick James Odell, after both their fathers, and from the moment he was placed in Xavier's arms, it was clear that the child had captured his father's heart completely. "He's going to be tall," Dr. Sullivan predicted, examining the unusually long baby. "Takes after his parents." "Good," Xavier said firmly. "The world needs more tall people with good hearts." As Frederick grew, so did the Odell Ranch. Xavier's careful management and Elizabeth's sharp mind for business turned their operation into one of the most respected in Kansas. They added more land, more cattle, and eventually, more children: a daughter, Margaret, born in 1876, and another son, William, in 1879. All three Odell children inherited their parents' height, though Margaret also had her mother's honey-brown hair and gentle disposition. They grew up confident and secure, never experiencing the mockery Elizabeth had endured, partly because times were changing but mostly because Xavier and Elizabeth had created a family culture where height was celebrated, not shamed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Elizabeth with a party at their ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from miles around. The house and grounds were decorated with wildflowers and paper lanterns, reminiscent of the church social where they had first danced together. As twilight fell, Xavier led Elizabeth away from their guests to the stream that ran through their property, the same spot where he had proposed years earlier. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, presenting her with a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Elizabeth opened it, she found a tiny portrait of their family on one side and an inscription on the other. "Stand tall, stand proud, stand loved." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not as beautiful as you," Xavier replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "These 10 years with you have been the happiest of my life, Elizabeth. I thank God every day that I walked into that mercantile and found you." "Even with all the challenges?" she asked. There had been many drought, cattle disease, economic downturns that had threatened their livelihood. "Especially with the challenges," Xavier said firmly. "Facing them with you has only made me love you more." They returned to their party hand in hand, and when the music started, Xavier led Elizabeth onto the dance floor. Despite his old leg injury, which still troubled him occasionally, he moved with confidence and grace. "Everyone's watching us," Elizabeth murmured as they waltzed. "Let them," Xavier replied with the same words he'd used so many times before. "Let them see what love looks like," and the people of Dodge City did see. They saw a couple who stood tall together, literally and figuratively. They saw a family that had flourished despite initial predictions of failure. And they saw a love that had not only endured but deepened, growing stronger with each passing year. As Elizabeth and Xavier danced beneath the stars, surrounded by friends and family, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a lonely, self-conscious young woman trying to make herself smaller to the confident, respected rancher's wife she now was, the transformation still amazed her. All her life, she had been told that her height was a liability, something to overcome or disguise. It took Xavier Odell, a man who stood even taller, to show her that what made her different also made her exceptional. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how far we've come," she replied. "And how grateful I am that you really saw me that day in the mercantile." "Best day of my life," Xavier said simply. "The day I found the woman I'd been looking for without even knowing it." As the years passed, the Odell family continued to thrive. Their children grew into confident adults, each making their own way in the world. Frederick took over the ranch operations, expanding into new territories. Margaret became a teacher, following in her mother's footsteps. William, the youngest, studied law and eventually became a judge, the tallest judge in Kansas, as he liked to boast. Elizabeth and Xavier aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered illnesses, financial setbacks, and the inevitable losses that come with time, but through it all, they remained each other's steadfast support. In 1912, 40 years after their first meeting, they celebrated their anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The Odell family had become one of the most respected in Kansas, known for their integrity, generosity, and yes, their remarkable height. As they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset, Xavier took Elizabeth's hand, still a perfect fit after all these years. "You ever think about that day in the mercantile?" he asked. "Often," Elizabeth admitted. "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't walked in at that exact moment." "I would have found you eventually," Xavier said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be, Elizabeth." She squeezed his hand, believing him. In a world that had once made her feel too tall, too much, too different, Xavier Odell had helped her find her perfect place, standing tall beside him, neither of them diminished by the other, both of them made stronger together. And that, Elizabeth reflected as she rested her head on her husband's shoulder, was the greatest gift of all, to be loved not despite one's differences, but because of them, to be seen clearly and cherished completely. To find someone who stood even taller beside you with pride, facing the world together, come what may.